For this dried pasta, I'm using the flour here from Naples. There are other flours available, I'm sure, but this is one that works very well. And it's available either online or at Italian groceries. I got mine at Giovanni's Italian Grocery in San Francisco. This water is from the San Geronimo Valley, from a spring. It's pure, no chemicals. It's important to have as pure water as possible. And the proportion that I use is 5 parts flour and 3 parts water. So you can make that proportion however you're, with whatever amount you're going to use. I'm going to use 300 grams of flour and 180 grams of water. I'm going to place those in the oven as well as the cutting board so that they're all at about the same temperature when I start. Okay, I'll cut you back on when I start that. So the first step in making the dried pasta is to place all the ingredients, the cutting board, the flour, and the water, in a warm place. I'm using the oven on a bread-proof setting at 100 degrees to bring them all to a temperature of around 100 or so. Not too hot, but pretty warm, like on a nice hot Italian day. And I'm going to do that and then be right back to you. All right. Removing our ingredients from the oven. They're nice and warm. Putting a tea towel down here so that we can use the board without it moving around. And we're ready to start. This is nice and warm, tested out. It's good to have your hands warm too, as well as clean. Make a little well. And actually, you will need a bench scraper as well. One of these. I covered the water with plastic wrap so it wouldn't evaporate, because we need a pretty close ratio. 5 parts flour, 3 parts water. Pour this into the middle and begin. Oh, I see that water is not quite warm enough. Let's put it in the microwave. It's still warm to the touch down here, however. Pour the rest in there. Yeah, that's better. The reason you want it warm is because it causes the gluten reaction to go faster and be more complete by the time the dough solidifies into a malleable mass that you make the pasta from. And if it's too cold, that process is slowed down and the gluten is less well formed. The gluten is what makes the noodle pasta-like. And since there are only 2 ingredients in here, the gluten needs all the help it can get from the water. So once this starts to get thick, this looks like a mess, but it comes off in your hands fairly easily. Start to bring it together with the bench knifer. Chop it in there like that. The dough will seem rather dry, and it is, but it will hydrate up nicely eventually. Some people use a food processor for this. I'm not a fan of that because although it mixes the dough very thoroughly, it also, I think, unnecessarily shortens the gluten strands that you want to be as long as possible. Okay, so once that's kind of done, incorporated, you can begin to knead it. So you just bring it together like this. And there's a lot of dry stuff in here, but it will become absorbed. And it's still warm to the touch. You just roll the flour off your hands like this, and it comes off pretty easily. It's important to use the right flour as well. You can use all-purpose flour, I suppose, or double O, as they call it, which is a slightly larger grain than the all-purpose. You can use bread flour, but I find I've used all of those, and this is by far the best flour to use for pasta that will be dried, which this will be. I'm going to film the basic technique of kneading it. Actually, you can knead it any way you want to, as long as it gets the job done. But once you get all this dry, and it's still warm to the touch, I might add, your goal is to keep it warm to the touch right up into the stage where you're actually kneading it for real. And you just incorporate all those in there like that. They eventually will stick. Another thing about the flour mixture, once you begin to get it to this stage, it dries out. So if you leave the dough for any length of time, it needs to be covered. Otherwise it will dry out unacceptably. Okay, we're almost to the point where we can start the kneading process. It's okay that these little pieces are in there. Once you start kneading it, it will coalesce into a manageable mass. Okay, we're there just about. Alright, the way I knead is I pull from the side, turn it a slight amount, and this little portion here, push it into the middle. And just keeping that pattern up, you knead it for 10 minutes. That's a long time. So it's a fair amount of work. And that is exactly how you do it. So there's little patterns in there, like that. It's still fairly bumpy at this stage, but I'm going to cut it off now, so you don't watch me knead this for 10 minutes. Okay, I've been kneading this for about 9 minutes now. You notice the radial pattern. Now, as you knead this way, you'll see that it develops a hollow spot in here, so you can just get rid of that by turning it over, and then starting the kneading new with that same pattern. It's also wise not to crush it. You don't want to put all your weight into it. You don't want to break the dough. You want it as smooth as possible. And it becomes slightly elastic, smooth and shiny. You can over knead it but you can't underknead it. Underkneading it will result in an unacceptable dough. And after you do this a few times, you'll really feel when it's the right time to stop kneading. I've heard anywhere from 8 minutes to 12 minutes. I find 10 minutes is about right. Of course, it will depend on your kneading technique. If you knead very lightly, you might need slightly longer. But again, you don't want to break the dough, especially around the edge here. You want that to be smooth. And it should kind of bounce back a little lightly when it's touch feel elastic like this. And that is about where we want it. At this point, you cover it with plastic wrap. And allow it to sit for 30 minutes. Reserve the plastic wrap also, because you'll need it when you're processing the dough, because you can't process it all at once normally with normal equipment. I'm just going to leave it there. Room temperature is fine, doesn't have to be in the fridge. This big boy will be used to actually make the pasta sheets. And we're going to make the noodles themselves with the hand process with this hand pasta machine here, which I'll show you. So while we wait, I'm going to turn it off and we'll be back to you. Alright, it's been 30 minutes. And we'll unwrap this in the plastic. It shouldn't stick very much. If it sticks, your dough is too wet. And as I said before, keep the plastic handy because you'll need it. Also, I cleaned the bench knife and the surface of the cutting board of all kind of hardened bits of dough that were left over, because those can get into the noodle and disrupt the structure of it. So I want it fairly clean here. Doesn't have to be spotless, but just free of pieces. I have a piece of Schedule 40 that I use to kind of beat this down, flatten it out a little bit. What I'm going to do is divide it in half, because it's very difficult to work with the whole batch of dough at once. That's why I have these marks. These marks are actually halfway between the edges so that I can line them up a little better. And just cut it with the bench scraper. Put the unused half. We'll be doing that later, but I don't want it to dry out, so I can keep it in there. Speaking of drying out, this is a homemade pasta drying rack. I put some pieces of tape on it, and I'm going to stick it down to the counter. I am going to get rubber feet eventually, but I've been too lazy to do that. This is just a homemade one. Use the all useful Schedule 40. Drilled a hole in there, and I put some dowels, 3/8" dowels, and make a little, like a clothesline thing here. Let me get it there. And it turns, so that when I put the pasta on, I can turn it from one side to the other without walking around it. You can buy these online for cheap. I just made this one because it was handy. They're 13 or 14 bucks, up to, however much you want to spend. Anyway, that's what we hang the pasta on to dry. So back to this. I'll flatten it out as Helen says on her video, about like a pancake. Now, if you were doing this by hand, you would use the rolling pin to flatten it out to a thickness of 1 millimeter, but we're going to use the machine. And you'll see how nifty that is, labor saving. Now, this machine here, try and not get the other machines into the shot. This dial, you want it set on 1. It's a little 1 right there. And it goes up to, I believe it's 8, which is the thinnest. And basically it moves this piece back and forth. You can see that moving. Start with 1. Now, an important thing here. Make sure it's locked in. There's also a manual one that has similar markings on it. But one thing you don't want to do is forget where, if you made the noodles and made the thinner sheets, and you go back to processing your second piece over here, don't forget to set it back to 1. Because if you take a piece like this and try and run it through on 4, the machine is going to struggle with it, and it'll possibly ruin your pasta. So, now, another thing. I got some extra flour here. I don't really need it at the moment, but it's a good idea to, and this is the same flour that's in the pasta, to cover this so that it doesn't stick to the board. You turn on your machine, and you run it through, like that. Now what you want to do is try and make this piece as square as possible. Because it makes the noodles a lot easier to handle when they come out. And you can run this through a fair amount of times until you get that good square shape. The machine's already struggling with this thickness. I should have probably made it a little bit thinner. As you have more material up here, it's going to want to splay out. So eventually you're probably going to want to trim that. Okay. Let's just you know what? That is going to be too wide. Let's just take some of that off. And when you get it looking about like you want it, run that through. See, it's getting a little damp, so I want to make sure we don't want it sticking on us. Run it through about 4 times. Each time it runs through, it stretches it a little bit more. And you're going to put it through. Don't worry too much about that tail sticking there. Okay. At this point, you want to divide it in half. This camera down. That's where my marks come in. It's fairly cumbersome to deal with long pieces, and this will be, you'll end up cutting these in half again, actually. And so, put one of those each through again. If you find these are very, very sticky, you've probably used too much water. As well as being difficult to handle. If it's too sticky, it can get pieces of dough inside this gizmo here, and it's very difficult to clean. So I'm going to take this dough and put it back with this so it doesn't dry out. So now you go to the next two and run these through again. And on these different settings, running them through twice is sufficient. This is your ideal piece of dough. It's nice and square. It's a little on the wide side, so you have no place to go on width. It's less important how square they are as how even they are. Notice it paused there. You have to kind of feed it in. If it gets stuck back here, then it'll ruin your dough. Make sure that if they start to feel sticky, just put a little extra flour on it. This piece is a little anomalous shape there. Okay, we're going to 3. We're actually going to stop on 4. That's my thickness I want my noodles at. You can go all the way up to 8, but I can guarantee you 8 is very thin. Since these noodles are going to be dried, in order to keep them from fracturing on the drying rack, which they do fairly easily, we want to keep the noodles fairly robust in their dimensions. So that would mean stopping at 4. It's best to handle this with the back of your hand, by the way, so your fingers don't poke through. Okay. Now it's time to divide them again. This will be the final time. And we're going to go up to 4. Let's go this way. Okay. And when they're at this stage, you just put them on this. Dry out a little bit. Now to make the actual noodle, we're going to use the manual machine, so I have to change the setup. And it's good to let these dry a little bit on the rack. That one went in a little cattywampus, so that's alright. If you try and do them too wet, the noodles will really stick together and not be pleasant to handle. But don't let them get too dry either, because then the noodle will cut weirdly, and you don't want that either. This one already with its shape is going to cut a little weirdly, so we're going to have some short noodles on this one, but that's alright. You notice I put a minimum of flour on here. You only want as much flour as you absolutely need to keep it from sticking. Too much extra flour will make the noodle bumpy and not make the mouth feel what you want with a noodle. You want it smooth. There we go. So I made 8 of these, so the second 4 will be for this other batch of dough. So I'm going to cut it off here, and we'll resume when it's time to roll the noodle itself. All right, we've rolled the other 4 pieces up. These are a little bit longer. They're thinner, and they have a little more dough in them, so the noodle is going to be longer, but it's still an acceptable length. You want to make sure they don't stick together. That's the problem. That's going to be a problem. You have to make sure these stay separate. And they should dry out maybe a half hour. And they should feel like leather. That's what Helen Rennie says, and she's usually right about stuff. So when these dry out, actually I'm going to start the noodle process with these. This is where I had my first, so they all have the same amount of time to dry roughly, because it takes about as much time to make a noodle as it did to make the original piece. So I'm going to set up my manual machine. And we're going to cut what they call in here linguine. Now, most of the linguine you buy in the store is actually extruded rather than rolled like this. And it has is more like oblong spaghetti in cross section. This linguine, which this cutter is a little flatter. There's also a fettuccine setting on the big machine over here, but I find those noodles to be a little bit too thin for dried pasta. They fracture easily, so it's not something you want. Now, finding a good location for doing this is a little bit of a hassle, because since the noodles drape off here, you're going to have to find a place that's very secure, because this needs to be tightened quite a bit in order to keep the machine from moving around when you're cranking. And also there has to be room for the noodles to drop so you can catch them. Put this little thing in here, make sure the grooves line up with the inside of this. There. And you cinch it down pretty tightly. You can use a wrench to do this, but this plastic handle, so if you really crank down on it, we could have a broken handle. That's sufficient right there, I believe. And this piece has a little keyway that, where is it? In here. Let's see, right there. It goes into these slots. Like that. And the whole machine is operated with a crank. And you put the crank into this is the main pasta roller with its thickness gauge over here, which I didn't use for this. Although it's perfectly usable, the machine is just easier because you don't need 2 hands. And this cranks, this is how it cranks. So when you're over here doing the noodles, you're cranking it this way. And this comes out easily, so kind of keep an eye on that. Don't let the handle roll out on you mid-noodle, because that makes the noodles very difficult to retrieve. And you want to cover this area with newspaper or something like that, because you will lose a few pieces of noodles off this. So when they dry out, I'll be back to you. Alright, coming back to these, they've been drying for about 20 minutes, and they seem to be about the right dryness, and I'm going to run them through the machine. Show you what that is. I need to really see. It's going to be hard to catch on camera. Let's see if I can do it. Hold them with this hand. I might add the machine is a lot easier to use than this, because you don't have the problem with the unfree hand. So you just start these up, start running them through, and catch them as they come out. Notice the ones that fall on the floor. And you put them back on the rack like this. It pays to separate them right now because if they dry together, it's going to be unfortunate. And you just drape them over like that. Try and make them even. This is the part I have not mastered yet, obviously. A master would be able to lay them out in order and not overlapping, but we're not there yet. It's important to separate them at this point, because once they grow together, they're difficult to get them apart. And they start drying pretty quickly, so you got to move along. Sometimes they're not rescuable, but I think this one will be. And it can give rise to cattywampus noodles, which you can cull out later. While these dry, you're going to be continuing to move these along the wood so that they don't stick to the wood, because they will do that also. Well, I'm separated out nicely so they're not together, like that. Then you grab your next sheet. Alright, here they are on the shelf, and I'm going to set them to dry. You can see the monitor in there. Hello. And when they dry, as they're drying, they'll curl up a little bit, and you have to keep kind of moving them like this on the wood to make sure they don't stick to the wood. You have to do this a number of times because they will tend to stick until they're pretty well dry. And that is it for the pasta. As far as cooking it goes, this pasta generally takes about 6 minutes to cook. Okay?